So what we're really looking for in life, according to the concept in this teaching, which is based on an experience, based on a journey, an investigation of life. So the teachings, the concepts in the teachings are not just theory found in a book, but rather the knowing one's own experience of certain people who have come to see life differently. And so the teaching, it's my experience. It was Ramesh's experience. The teaching says what we're really looking for in life, whether we realize it or not. And what that means is most people don't realize it. So it's a hint. What we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, is peace of mind in daily living. So that is to wake up, to be in life at peace with ourself, ultimately. At peace with the other, at peace with how circumstance unfolds. And being at peace with the other, at peace with circumstance, really all comes down to being at peace with yourself, being comfortable with yourself. And one of the key foundations on which this peace of mind stands is the deep seeing, the realization, the recognition that life is a happening, that life is a story essentially unfolding. Why I say it's a story is because circumstance unfolding, you could say, is like a story unfolding. You know, the bird flew out of the tree, landed on the gatepost, knocked over a stone that landed on a stick that knocked over another stone that rolled down the hill and bumped into the glass door, making a knocking noise. And the person inside leaned forward to have a look what was going on. And as they leant forward, they noticed a $5 bill underneath the table, and so on and so on. It's a story. It's a storyline. It's life unfolding. And we play a significant role in the unfolding of life. We are part of, we, me, you, and everyone else in life is part of the unfolding of life. And each of us have our experience of the unfolding of life from a particular perspective. So we could say that actually I only have my own experience of the story of life unfolding. And it's that story of life, the experience of the story of life that we have, that needs to be seen as a predetermined unfolding according to God's will. That everything is happening exactly as it's destined to happen. That nothing is out of place. That a leaf falls off a tree at exactly the time it's destined to fall off. And it follows a path to the ground exactly that it's destined to follow. And that even though it feels like I am a part of the story and in control of how I move through the story, everything that happens through us is a happening according to God's will. That the thoughts that arise are exactly arising at the point in time they're destined to arise, and the content of those thoughts is exactly as it's destined to be. And the actions and feelings that arise subsequent or simultaneous to the thoughts are exactly as it's destined to be. And this is the case for one's own feelings, thoughts, emotions, actions. The words that come out of the mouth are part of the story of life, and they're coming out exactly as it's destined for them to come out. And if we can start to see the stubbing of our toe as death, the bird singing outside our window as part of destiny unfolding, the rain coming down and the clothes getting wet is destiny unfolding. If you leave your car window open overnight and it rains heavily and you come and your car is, the seat is soaked, that was a happening according to destiny, exactly as it was destined to happen. The forgetting to put the window up, part of destiny unfolding. And the thing that throws us off here is it doesn't feel like a destined story. It doesn't feel like a story that can only turn out the way it turns out, but rather it feels like a story that will turn out the way that I make it turn out. So I won't talk for that long today. I'll take primarily questions. Last satsang, I don't think I took any questions. So I see someone's already put their hand up. So we'll go with questions shortly. So seeing that life is an unfolding according to God's will, according to life, not according to me or the other, allows our attitude to what happens to change radically. Hello.
Hello, Roger. There is. It's beautiful to see you, and it's reassuring, and I really know that what you're speaking rings, goes very deep, and is true. There's just still fear inside of me coming up once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
And even this is destiny unfolding.
Indeed, yes.
Wow.
Everything is, nothing is outside of the story of life.
So the fear of dying is just a normal part of being a human being.
It's a normal part of being a human being as we have tended to be shaped, because as we've formed, we've developed a sense of self that is, in a way, not appreciating the present moment as an experience. And so an idea of who we are gets formed, and that idea of who we are is very threatened by its non-existence. It feels like something very significant will be lost upon death. And that feeling that something very significant is going to be lost upon death essentially stems from a non-recognition of the essence of what life is. So if we come to see life as an experience, then the absence of experience really is not such a big deal. It becomes a big deal when, so if we see life as an experience and realize that the sense of self arises within the experience, then death is the absence of experience. And that means the absence of the sense of self. And it hardly seems problematic. The problem, the fear of death always arises when there is a sense, when there is a self to conceptualize and to imagine its own absence. And what I mean by the fear arises when there is a self that conceptualizes its own absence. It is a self that imagines, well, maybe I've gone off track. There really can't be a problem once we're dead.
I see that, and
because,
but it's still disturbing. I mean, it's still an uncomfortableness in this, and but I hear you, and it makes totally sense. So there's one part I can hear the teaching; it really resonates in me. I feel a shift inside of my thinking and feeling, and there are many things happening without me doing anything. But there's still this remnant then of the separate self. It's still there because there is once in a while the fear. And I make myself, when I experience this fear, I allow myself to die. I mean, I have this idea, okay, it's just fine. I cannot explain it. And maybe that's just, again, another working of the old ego trying to survive its conditioning or something like this.
Yes, I think the way you described it is very good, is because you've reversed engineered the answer. You said the fear is there from time to time. And so by default, that means that the remnants of the doership and attachment are still at play. And I would say that's exactly the way we need to see it. So you have reversed engineered back, saying, okay, the fear is there. So why is fear there? Oh, because the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes still exists. And that makes complete sense, that as the process is changing the dynamic, there are going to be stretches of that process when the identity is changing, but it hasn't completely dissolved. And that's the flip-flopping that we tend to experience, is because we are experiencing life from a place where the doership and attachment isn't active, and then we experience life as peaceful and there is no fear. There aren't even any thoughts about death. We are actually just happy being here now. And then something happens and a part of the system gets reactivated, a part of the system that includes the doership and attachment to outcome in it. And so then we go into the flop phase. And that's all that's happening. It's the story unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. Someone asked recently, on one of the comments, they said, oh, the teaching talks about non-doership, but it doesn't address the fear that comes when one thinks of death. And when I read the comment, I thought, oh, a fair comment, although it's a comment that is not appreciating in that moment the fact that the part of the teaching that says happiness is not to be found in outcomes, that part of the teaching is addressing death and ultimately dissolving the importance of death, or the significance of death. And we get to experience that each time there is involvement in an outcome. Essentially, what's happening is we're saying internally on a very deep level, when there is suffering because of an outcome, we're saying my sense of self, my existence, my wholeness has been attacked by that outcome, has been attacked by someone not fulfilling the commitment that they made, has been attacked by, my liberties being restricted because of, legislation or whatever. And that creates an uncomfortableness in the moment where we feel diminished by that outcome. And if we remember what the teaching is pointing to, your happiness is not to be found in the flow of life, we might find ourselves dropping before or dropping beyond, whichever way you want to say it, or transcending the narrative of, this event is an attack on who I am. And we might find ourselves just coming back to a presence that is here regardless of these circumstantial outcomes. So if we can find the essence of the human being and not become involved in circumstance, which essentially only happens when the attachment falls away. Because if the attachment is there, it's dragging us into involvement in the circumstance. So if we do find that this movement inside starts to happen where we drop out of involvement with circumstance and find ourselves regrounded, then that's where we realize that we're no longer afraid of death. Because in the same way, if we find ourselves attached to the notion of death, meaning feeling uncomfortable about the notion of death, inevitably there is a thinking process that says, oh, but when I die, I won't have these things, or I won't have finished my mission, or I don't know what I will have then. And once again, we're caught in a thinking that might not be a conscious thought process. It might be a very deep down thought process. And if the process takes us, if our journey towards peace can pull us out of that thinking, conscious or unconscious, and drop us back into the present moment, then we can see even the fear of death, the uncomfortableness coming from thinking about death can get cut off. But because death is sort of the ultimate outcome, the ultimate assault on what we have identified ourselves as, obviously that fear is much deeper than some of the others. So it makes sense that the fear of death is going to keep recurring until such time as the structure has completely dissolved. And that doesn't mean that we won't be biologically afraid of harm that could kill the body. So this is not suggesting that if someone were to come and hold a knife to my throat and threaten to kill me, that I wouldn't have a biological fear of the circumstance. That I suspect would very much be the case, that I would be scared. I would, if I had the opportunity, I would run away. I wouldn't like to remain at threat of death. And yet, having said that, if the news comes that, you know, like everyone, death is not far away from physical illness or such thing, then the thinking mind story that goes into a story about what this means about me is unlikely to kick in.
There is lots of peace on my side and gratitude for the teaching. It really works, and I can really say, yeah, that it's wonderful. It's really amazing. Is it okay to say that my suffering is only, it requires the thinking mind?
Yes, they are not two. Suffering is the thinking mind.
And I cannot suppress the thinking. I can remember the teaching, and by this, the thinking mind kind of dissolves.
Yes, and when a remembering of the teaching happens, it's not even Holger doing it as a volitional action, but rather it's remembering happening because Holger has been shaped by life a certain way, and in a particular moment, the consequence of the circumstance and you being shaped a certain way includes the memory arising, or the thought, the remembrance, oh, my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. And so when that happens, it can cut off suffering. But even the happening of that is part of the unfolding of life.
It's amazing. It's beautiful.
Yes. It's a big change.
Wonderful. Thank you. Big hug, and thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Holger. Hello, Abhimanyu.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, hello.
Hi, Roger. I can't just express my gratitude in words with how much this teachings and these concepts that you explain is helping each one of us, not just me. I just want to thank you once again. I have a, yeah.
My pleasure.
So the question that I have in mind today is that how important is it to have a structure and a routine in daily living? And a connected question to that would be that when we talk about non-doership, but we are still striving to achieve, how does one go about setting goals and achieving them without having the sense of doership there?
Well, because doership and attachment to outcomes tend to be sort of two sides of one coin. Sometimes it's necessary to, in a way, abandon both as important. And when that is happening, we might feel very good about it. It feels very right. And yet from the outside, if someone said to Ramesh, for example, I've given up all of my duties. I've stopped working. He would say, oh, well, you don't need to do that. Non-doership and non-attachment to outcomes doesn't require you to stop achieving things or stop functioning in life where outcomes will happen. So there is very much the possibility for us to apply ourselves fully to a task, be pleased when the outcome is favorable, and yet not be attached to the outcome. And that tends to be something that happens more as a refinement process. So what I mean by that is that tends to happen after, in a way, we might have abandoned a lot of activities that we previously thought were important, because we find that we see that there is an attachment to outcome in doing them, and so we sort of stop engaging in that way. And when that's happening, it can actually be very useful, because as I said, the doership and attachment to outcomes tend to be, and so it can be sometimes very hard to still engage in activities that are outcome bound, and not be attached to the outcome. So essentially, this is a bit like the process of renunciation. And so a monk may, as part of their training, as part of their practice, as part of their devotion to this quest, may be asked to give up certain pleasures, abstain from sex, abstain from alcohol, abstain from certain foods, live a very simple life, sleep on a hard bed, have cold showers, shave one's head, wear robes that don't distinguish you above anyone else. And that practice of renunciation is there essentially to break our attachment to those things. And it's one particular method of breaking the attachment. What we find when the attachment is broken essentially is a sense, oh, I have put all of these things aside, things that felt so important in my life, almost to the point where we were convinced if I don't have those things, life wouldn't be worth living. And the teaching that we find ourselves in convinced us that actually engaging in those activities or indulging in those pleasures is part of the problem. And so we find it in ourselves to decide that we will not indulge. And at some point we might find, even without all of those things, even without all the things that I thought were what would make life or what made life fulfilling, I feel an innate sense of contentment and fulfillment. So that practice of renunciation effectively is showing us that there is a part of ourself that is self-fulfilling, is self-contenting, and that those pleasures are not needed. And as we then start to refine past that point, we may start to notice that the pleasures in themselves are not the problem. That it was the identification, the attachment, the value that we attributed psychologically to the pleasure that made our identity, our psychological self, defined by those outcomes. And so it made us feel complete if we were getting them, and attacked and at threat if we were losing them. And so the process has shown us, no, you exist. Your essence is there with or without those pleasures. It starts off sort of saying you exist without those pleasures. And at some point we realize, oh, I can reintroduce those pleasures into life. And as long as I don't identify with them as being the source of my completeness, then they are pleasures that can be enjoyed. And I can enjoy them with the understanding that life will deliver pleasure sometimes, and then that pleasure will inevitably end and will be replaced with a new pleasure or a new pain. And so essentially that needs to be so you might not need to go through this renunciation stage where we push away pleasures. And in fact, pushing away pleasure is really as attitudinally incorrect as grasping pleasures. So the middle road is to neither reject or desire pleasure and pain, but rather to accept it as an inevitable part of life, and to know oneself prior to and post the coming and goings of pleasure and pain. So the important point is to, when living, is to do what you need to do, hopefully from a place of feeling, which is often not where we have lived from. We've lived from a conceptual framework of shoulds and shouldn'ts, a conceptual framework of I should do this now because that will deliver the best outcome, believing that outcomes are what will make us happy. So we've tended to historically live our day from a whole lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts, and that may in fact put in place certain routines that are based on this strategy to get the perfect outcome. And that strategy of shoulds and shouldn'ts can make life very rigid, and it means we bypass often a sense of being in flow with life as it is presenting in that particular moment. And we tend to lose that sensitivity because we're following a very rigid, at 8 o'clock I'll do this till 8:15, and then at 8:15 I do this till 9 o'clock. And it doesn't matter whether we feel like doing that or not, or whether something is different today than it was yesterday. We are just sort of conceptually bound by our shoulds and shouldn'ts. And that can lead, or that does lead, to a disconnection with part of ourself, or a dimension of ourself, the feeling dimension, and the sense of I amness, the essence of the human being, is always found on this feeling dimension rather than lost in concepts. We'll never find the essence I've been talking about, the self-contenting essence on the level of my shoulds and shouldn'ts. So that's why it's encouraged to come down and do what you feel like. So that might mean that our routines need to be heavily challenged. Do I do the shopping on a Saturday morning every Saturday? And maybe we say, well, actually, I'm going to do the shopping when I feel like it. Now we often think that, if I did things based on what I feel like, none of the important things will get done. I'll become lazy. I'll become irresponsible. And I think if we enter into doing based on feeling, there's a natural intelligence that means it won't turn out as we imagine, especially if we commit to this from a place of authenticness, an authenticness to connect to a deeper part of ourselves. There may be some road bumps along the way while the new structure gets balanced out. But I've found that overall it's much more efficient than we imagine it will be. So making spontaneous decisions, not having big plans for your week, and really doing what you feel like is a very exciting change in how we live life. And it requires a bit of bravery in a way, because it means that we have to explain to people who have got used to us doing things a certain way, especially got used to us doing things a certain way such that it delivers what they want. We may need to be firm in our commitment in changing how it is that we function to essentially be selfless or a self-fullness. We often think selfless means doing everything for the other, not for oneself. And I think selfless means, or self-fullness means doing what is authentic, and coming out of our shoulds and shouldn'ts into a more of a feeling, to me, is much closer to authenticity. And I'd just like to round this topic off by saying that routine in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. It depends what shapes the routine, what drives the routine to get set in place. Because when we are living spontaneously based on what we feel like, we may find that our days can look remarkably similar from one day to another. And that's not necessarily because of it being shaped that way because of shoulds and shouldn'ts, but rather because if we enjoy the morning air and we enjoy walking in the morning air, then there's a particular time when that can be done. So if we find we wake up and we feel like going for a walk, we'll go for a walk. Now, if we wake up at more or less the same time, we might find that each morning we feel like going for a walk. And so it can then become a routine. Now, if it's a routine not based on I have to, but I consistently feel like it, it doesn't have the same inhibiting effect as a routine that has been put in place by shoulds and shouldn'ts.
I would have another question. Thank you so much, Roger. It's a deeply ingrained concept since childhood, is about having discipline and to work hard. And at the same time, it seems contradictory, or when the concept is shared that do in the moment as you feel like doing. So could you just elaborate on that?
Well, it's quite possible. I find myself working quite hard sometimes, but only because I feel like it. So I can feel like doing a project and put 6 hours of work into the project. And so, we have this idea or experience that working hard is never something that we feel like. And that's often because of how we have engaged with work. And I think often we've engaged with work as something I should do. And so it never feels like working hard is pleasurable. And that's why I think it's so important to drop the shoulds and shouldn'ts and see what emerges out of that space. So it might mean that we drop our discipline for some time and then start finding a natural feeling to do the same work that we have dropped, but coming out of a different place. And we could be surprised that, I never thought I would enjoy cooking, or I never thought I would enjoy gardening, because in the past we might have done it as a should, not because I felt like it, but I should do it. So we never really got to feel it come up in its authentic form. So there isn't an obvious contradiction, or it might seem like there is a contradiction between doing what you feel like and working hard. But I think that's because of our ingrained way of approaching so many activities in life that we essentially resent them. We have done them because we have to, or we should do them, not because we want to. So we resent them, and then we think, how could I possibly feel like doing this sort of work? And that's why we need to drop the chains that keep us bound to living in a way where there's a resentment, and allow an authentic movement to come and start living us.
That's great. That's great. I mean, completely never heard this kind of a perspective. So thank you so much, Roger. Now I'll let others with the question.
Hi, Shuman.
Oh, hello, Roger. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Oh, thank you. And thank you once again for your teachings. They're really good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I mean, strangely, the answer you gave to the previous two questioners, you in a strange way, you answered my question, but basically all it is there's probably a strange irony in that I've got a wristwatch and it's got a quotation by Swami Vivekananda, and it says, that man has reached immortality who is disturbed by nothing material. And I got this watch many years ago because for me that is just absolute freedom. That's what I am. You know, just completely unattached, because it seems to me that I'm not really of this world. You know, this world, it seems like a distraction, and yet, you know, like what Holger was saying, I do have fears, especially in these times. For example, I am thinking, you know, with this pandemic and the measures of lockdown, I'm thinking it's going to be so difficult to survive economically. You know, how am I going to cope? And also, also silly things. These are very selfish things, but I have to just say it because this is what's going on in me. So before the pandemic, I was in Cambodia teaching English, and it was really good. I really enjoyed it, but it was a new career for me. Traditionally, I was a carer, but now that I'm back in the UK, I'm going to have to go back into care work. And I'm very fortunate in the sense that many people won't have jobs, and I got a job almost instantaneously, so I'm very lucky. But there's something inside me moaning a little bit, saying, "Oh, this is a huge backward step." But I think the real thing is, because it's going to be a changed world, my fear is, and this is a should. It's like a should, and I have talked to you about this before. For example, something is in me is saying, are you sure you're brave enough to deal with circumstances? So, for example, there's the fear that, you know, in my personally, I would prefer not to take a vaccine, and it looks like it's coming quite quickly. But I don't know what will happen. It could be that I do take a vaccine because the pressure will be too great. But there's a commentary in my head saying, you know, if you were to suffer the consequences of the vaccine, it's your fault. You didn't have a backbone to stand up for what is right. Or it's basically saying you don't have a backbone to be truly spiritual. You're weak, and therefore you'll deserve the bad consequences that could arise. It's a bit like in the olden days, you used to have the Protestant ethic, where only a few were God's select and the rest were the damned. And it's a little bit like that, which is going on in me, I feel.
So I have to ask, is it non-spiritual to take a vaccine?
No, the non-spiritual part is this my fear, because the reason I take a vaccine is because I'm scared of what my brothers would say, because I would be putting my parents at risk, and I really want to see my parents. I don't want to say no to them. It's because they're vulnerable. So what I mean by non-spiritual means that I am motivated by my fears.
Right. I see. Right, but if you reframe it, you said if you take the vaccine and there's a consequence, it's your fault. But if you don't take it, there can be a consequence, which would then be your fault, right?
It would, but the fault would be in it would be bad. Yes, the consequence, if I was to infect someone else who's vulnerable, yes, then yes, so that would be my fault. Yes, not so much the consequence if I was to catch COVID and die. That's not a fear, but yes, if I was to infect someone else, yeah.
Yeah. Well, what about if you weren't able to travel, and maybe not, let's say, earn the income that you want to earn by going back to Cambodia? That's a consequence, which would, in a sense, be your fault. I mean, I don't mean it by fault, but it would be a consequence of not. So, if you can create an idea of a negative consequence for taking the vaccine, I presume you mean some health consequence, right? Negative health consequence. If you can create or see that negative consequence, then there are any number of theoretical negative consequences for not taking it. So at least it should balance out, or at least give you another perspective on because we tend to be quite polarized and not see a counter argument to what's going on in our head. So the way you presented it is, I'm taking it because of a fear of what people would say if I don't take it, or what I won't be able to do if I don't take it. And I think that's looking at only one side of the picture. So if you can bring your head around and say, actually, I'm taking it because of what it will deliver, then your steel manning is one way of putting it, right? Steel manning is strengthening the opposite argument. How can you, which we tend to do very poorly, you know, if someone has a different idea to us, we do the opposite of steel manning their point of view, whereas it's actually quite sensible to go in and say, okay, let's see if I can build their argument, sort of put myself in their shoes and say, this is why I'm arguing for this. And our thinking that is attached does the complete opposite. As soon as it hears anything different to what has formed as the right position, based on our current tendencies, as soon as that's set in place, then we tend to what's called straw man the opposite concept, which is, you know, find complete fault in it. And often that comes from not even listening to what's being said, going into automatic attack of the concept of that notion. And if we can come in and build up the opposite side, we'll often find that our fears are one-sided. So I maybe I digressed in trying to and going into that in too much detail, but I was curious about your comment about you know, if I took the vaccine, I wouldn't be spiritually strong. And I thought that was because someone who's spiritually strong wouldn't take a vaccine, but you subsequently explained it as not so much about taking a vaccine or not taking a vaccine, but rather acting out of fear. So I'm glad for the clarification.
Yes. Thank you for that. And yes, you're right, because it's from my point of view, it's very important for me to travel. I just feel so much better being outside of the Western world. I don't know what it is. So the truth is, for that reason as well, I also probably, if I was left with no alternative, you know, I would take the vaccine, but I just feel a little bit of like I'm a hypocrite, or there's just like I've done something wrong, if that makes sense. And also the other thing about the polarization, it is a difficult one in terms of arguments, because obviously when you take a position, it's like you're defending your sense of self. And even though I'm conscious of it, I'm also conscious of the fact that if someone attacks my position, especially if it's a family member, not so much if it's not a family member, you can be quite civilized about it. But if it's a family member, then it hits right to the core. And it's very difficult to take the other person's point of view.
There's something in that we need to recognize, which we tend not to. I think we don't realize why people have different views, and sometimes quite radically different, and we can't understand how, for example, someone can promote a government, let's say, that is not supporting minorities. We just it doesn't make sense. How come someone doesn't agree with me when I support a government that is supportive of minorities? How come someone else isn't doing the same? They're supporting a government that is not supportive of minorities. And all we need to see is that we all have our own priorities, our own selfish, you could say, reasons. And selfish doesn't have to be looked at in a bad, negative connotation. It just means that, someone has a priority that is being delivered by something that is they have a priority that's being delivered, and so they're going to favor the deliverance of that priority. It doesn't mean that it doesn't really require us to be right. We just need to see, we all have different priorities. So what we find is we judge someone else for having, a priority of, let's say, money over someone else's civil liberties. And my point is here is not to say everyone needs to be perfect. So it's not about judging the other person for what their priorities are. It's simply recognizing they have a different priority, let's say financial benefit over the liberty of someone who is not them. And that's why they have this other view. At least if we see that, then the fact that people differ in opinion to us makes sense or is understandable. Then we can choose, or at least we can see without it being mixed up when we go in to argue what their priority is. Because most people won't say, hey, I'm voting for this person because he delivers this to me, and that is my priority. Especially if, in effect, what they're saying is, and the priority of that other person or that other person's liberty is not my priority. It's further down the list. That's essentially what we're all saying, is this is my priority and that's not my priority. And it makes sense that we're going to have different priorities. And if we can understand that, we'll then understand why someone doesn't agree with us. If we find ourselves needing to convert them into agreeing with us, we might realize, that's where my suffering starts. That's where I stop giving them freedom to be themselves. That's where I start insisting that they be like me. And so a little unpacking of this, this can be useful.
Yes, it can, because the first thing that came to me, for example, as I've mentioned before, I do have an interest in tribal peoples and the Australian Aborigines in particular, and I find their culture really fascinating. It's a very ancient culture, very rich spiritually, and there's so much we don't know about it. Even some of the languages are probably very rich, but it is my priority, my position. So normally if somebody was to speak of them as if they're just alcoholics, no good, the government is wasting money on them, it'll be very difficult in this case for me to try and see it from their point of view. The natural reaction is that, oh, they're just so ignorant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that can actually be the explanation. Is, oh, they're ignorant relative to the information you have, and that's why they have, you know, a different set of priorities or a different perspective on it. So if we see that, we then start needing ignorance to not be there. If we say, no, I have to change this ignorant perspective to be a non-ignorant perspective, that's where it can be useful for us to see that kicking in, because it essentially is saying, I need to control their genes and up-to-date conditioning. I need to control how they end up seeing this situation. And when it comes to, you know, imparting your perspective on someone else, that's rarely, especially when it's done with the intention of changing their point of view, very often it's not received well, and it's just not going to sink in. So there's no harm in trying, as long as we try with a very clear awareness of the nuances of doing this. And as soon as it starts creating attachment inside of us, hopefully we can land on it and see, actually, my happiness, and frankly, the happiness of the minority as well, is not dependent on outcomes. So we need to remember that, because every time we believe that the other is being attacked by an outcome, by someone's perspective that may deliver outcomes, we're essentially saying, yes, my happiness is dependent on outcomes. So any of these big topics, once we see them in such a way that they create uncomfortableness, hopefully the thought comes up and says, actually, it's not that important that people are ignorant, because that ignorance essentially is part of the circumstance. And my happiness, your happiness, the other's happiness is not to be found in outcomes. And if we jump in to this topic as if we have to change their point of view, what we're saying is, my happiness, your happiness, and the other person's happiness is dependent on you changing your view. And so by jumping in an attached way, we're essentially reinforcing the mistaken belief that my happiness is to be found in circumstance. So it's, as I said, it's worth unpacking what's going on.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you, because I can see it as an intellectual understanding, but there's different layers to it. But thank you very much.
You're welcome. Even if the other thinks their happiness is to be found in outcomes, and thinks that the way they are treated is their unhappiness, that doesn't make it true. It means that they are unhappy because of that attitude. And they will tell you that they're unhappy because of the way that they are treated. And, you know, it's so easy for us to believe that, because we tend to have an attachment to circumstance, and so we see a tough circumstance, and we're convinced that that is what is that's what is taking the other person's happiness away. So that's why it's so important to become clear that happiness for the human being is available. It's available in the form of peace of mind, and peace of mind essentially requires a deep, deep recognition that circumstance is not where my happiness is going to be found. And so that's the basis on which an internal attitude of who cares can arise once a discussion gets to a certain point where we see that there is a lack of harmony between two people because of a differing of ideas. A part of us can arise saying, actually, who cares? Who cares that this person doesn't understand the culture, doesn't appreciate the hardships that they've gone through in the history of their, their civilization, their history. Who cares? That becomes the attitude, which is the letting go of a topic that, if we hang on to it, is just going to escalate into more and more uncomfortableness with ourselves and with the other.
Yes, and who cares is the freedom. Who cares? Who cares is the realization that my nature is free.
Exactly.
Delusion. It was delusion, but so long as you're caught in that delusion, you are in bondage. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Roger.
You're welcome. Hi, Martin.
Hi, Roger.
Hi there.
I think this is very interesting, where things have taken us today. It's not really a question. I suppose the question is, this concept of I am not the doer. It just seems to me that somewhere along the line, people have adopted this concept that you can be responsible for giving somebody else a virus. If I don't wear a mask, if I don't social distance, if I don't take a vaccine, and incidentally, as I understand it, a vaccine enables your immune system to kill the virus if it enters your body, but you can still carry the virus. And this particular vaccine by Pfizer only works on 93% of the population anyway. So, the previous questioner was saying, well, if I don't take this vaccine, my brothers may say that I could give it to my parents. Well, it's up to the parents to take the vaccine to protect themselves. If we adopt, it just seems to me the question I'm asking you, Roger, is if we adopt that we are not the doer, but life is unfolding and it's all our destiny, it's our destiny for people to get COVID-19 and recover from it or die. We cannot be the doer, surely. It's our destiny to carry COVID and supposedly give it to other people. Do you understand that's the question? There's this concept somewhere that we're all responsible, that we're just human beings with life living us. We cannot control whether other people get the virus from us, can we?
Ultimately, no. You can do everything right, and someone could still get the virus from you.
Sure.
So we never ever have ultimate control in life, and all of whatever happens, as I started off saying today, is part of the unfolding story of life. We need to see that the non-doership is really about an attitude. So it means once something has happened, then our attitude to it is, okay, that happened. It happened because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance I found myself in and the way that I acted. And so when we look back, our attitude is one that doesn't say, oh, that happened only because of me, and seeing me as a independent entity that has to feel completely worthless. That's where the attitude of non-doership is most helpful when looking back at events to cut off any guilt and blame. And it is the attitude that when looking forward in life, we say, well, life is going to turn out one way, and it's going to turn out according to destiny, and my happiness isn't dependent on how it turns out. So the understanding is an understanding that is an attitudinal understanding. It doesn't say, because you're not the doer, cross the road with your eyes closed. That would be a mistake of the notion of the understanding of non-doership. If you do cross the road with your eyes closed, which in theory increases your risk of getting hit by a car significantly, and you do get hit by a car, then the best attitude is to say, I crossed the road with my eyes closed because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the consequence was to get hit by a car. And I understand that at the time it seemed like the right thing to do, and I did it. So hopefully it becomes clear that the attitude is an attitude that we apply to things that have happened or things that we are worried about that might happen. That's what the attitude is useful for. When it comes to how should I act in the next moment, if it's creating worry, then the attitude of non-doership and non-attachment can be useful. But if we're assessing in a situation, then it makes sense to assess it based on its merits, and to make a decision based on the merits in front of you. Understanding that the decision you make is part of your genes and up-to-date conditioning and destiny unfolding. So I'm not advocating people taking a vaccine or not taking a vaccine. I think that will all unfold exactly as it's destined to unfold. But for someone to say, for example, taking a vaccine won't help, well, I'll say, well, it might if it reduces the capacity to contract the illness. Then taking the vaccine will make a difference. However, because we're not in control of the outcomes, we may take the vaccine and find that there are very unfortunate consequences to that we didn't foresee. So the underlying principle is we don't know what the outcomes are going to be. We can't control the outcomes, but we shouldn't use that as a reason to say, in that case, I can do anything. Because we do have the capacity to weigh up what is the best course of action, which doesn't guarantee it's the best course of action, but we have an ability to weigh based on, probabilities or how we see the situation, and then make that decision.
Yeah, I get all of that, Roger, but as I understand it, a vaccine only stops you getting the symptoms, the illness. It doesn't prevent you giving it to somebody else. You can't control that. Do you see?
Yeah, but we're not getting into the merits of having a vaccine or not having a vaccine. But
no, I'm not. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying a vaccine can only protect you. It cannot protect you from giving it to somebody else. That's what I'm saying. People seem to adopted this concept that if I have a vaccine, then I cannot give the virus to somebody else. Do you see?
Yes.
You don't develop symptoms. You still carry the virus in your body. It just doesn't make you ill, if you like. Your immune system prevents you from becoming ill.
Yes. So in that case, you would take the vaccine to prevent yourself from getting ill, I guess.
If you think a vaccine will stop you from getting ill, then take the vaccine. If you don't think it will, then don't take the vaccine. That's what I'm advocating. It's for people to make, but they need to have the correct information. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. Yeah.
But I take the point of, don't cross the road without your eyes shut, But there seems to be this concept that you can be responsible for giving somebody else the virus. People are exposed to the virus. What happens to them is due to their genetic makeup and their up-to-date conditioning. It's got nothing to do with you. If you see what I mean, you can take if you're a doctor and you're operating on, you take all the precautions for not passing on diseases and viruses to your patients. But as a normal human being, you cannot be responsible for not giving somebody else the virus. If you see what I mean, it's not within your capacity. But but that's my comment anyway.
Yeah, but it's a bit like sort of shooting arrows up into the air and saying if it hits someone,
it's my fault.
Well, it's saying it's not my fault if it hits someone on the way down.
But that's making the assumption that you can choose whether to fire an arrow or not.
Yeah. So that's so when we say it's your fault, if you're shooting arrows up into the sky, the underlying attitude has to be, yes, I did that, and in hindsight, it was a silly thing to do, but I did it because at the time, my genes and up-to-date conditioning said this is a great thing to do. And so let's say that happened, and we got someone in the leg. Then to me, the ideal thing is for me to say, I'm sorry that you've got an arrow in your leg. It was my fault. I should have thought about it more. Understanding that actually this is destiny unfolding, and attitudinally not beating ourselves up and feeling like a worthless human being because this is what has happened. And it's where we mix up the attitude of non-doership and make it an excuse in circumstance that can be a bit murky. So if we go around saying, the fact you got hit was because you were in the wrong spot at the wrong time, then that may be taking things a little far.
But
you also may have
I get that, Roger, but we're not talking about firing arrows up into the air. We're talking about life unfolding for everybody, and nature kills people. You know, it's if you don't die of COVID-19, you're going to die of something else. That's the point. You can do everything in your power to and get all the help you can to not die of COVID-19, but the reality is some people will die from it and some people won't. It's true.
Yeah. So this is where we have to be very clear attitudinally versus circumstantially, because I can't come up and stab you and kill you and then say to the judge, well, he's going to die of something, so I just made it this.
Oh no, I'm not saying that. You know, it's trying to control the uncontrollable, if you see what I mean. A bit like King Canute, wasn't it? You know, he could control everybody and everything, so they put him on a throne and said, stop the waves coming in, and he got very wet.
No, we definitely have to go back to the fact that life is, especially in relation to these topics, this is why, to me, I really don't, I don't give much importance to what someone chooses. I know everyone is going to choose something. If we break it down into pro or against, let's say, a vaccine, I know people are going to be on one side or the other of the line. And assuming the neutral line is very, very thin, where no one can stand on it, people can be very close to neutral, or frankly, if we throw neutral in as a third option, I know anyone of the world's population is going to be in one of these three positions. And so I'm not in opposition to how everyone lands, because I'm in favor of everyone being in one of those three positions. However, if someone says to me, for example, because I put out 2 or 3 posts at the very beginning of this situation happening that was circumstantial. When I looked at the situation, it was very clear that this is a virus that is contracted via, exchange of droplets from an infected person. So it means if you come in contact with less people, there is less chance of spreading the disease. So to me, the notion of staying inside, socially distancing, is not I'm not saying it's the best thing. I'm saying it is going to restrict the transmission of the illness. Now, whether someone agrees with that or does it is not so important. But when I looked at it just simply mathematically, it's very simple that one of the things that you can do to flatten the curve is to not put yourself in contact with as many people as you ordinarily would. And if we reduce that contact, then the spread is going to drop. Now, I don't know what the other consequences of that are, because I don't have the capacity to work out how everyone is going to react to being in isolation. There are obviously going to be other negative consequences, the spread of the virus. But on a very simplistic level, stay at home, don't interact with people until the situation gets understood a bit better and the disease is going to spread, or the virus is going to spread less. That to me was simple physics. But I don't expect people to process it my way, and I'm not even saying the way that I process the physics of it is right, but it was my way. So if someone puts forward a different argument, and I've considered those arguments, then I could find reason to disagree with the rationale, but I won't disagree with the person having that rationale.
I can see that, but that as a concept, yes, that makes eminent sense. But it's rather like chucking the baby out with the bathwater, Roger, don't you think? that, yeah, if you've got the capacity to stay at home and don't mix with other people and you're happy doing that, then yeah, then that's your choice. But you know, we've got a government in this country, in the UK, where they've completely destroyed our economy. We just don't have an economy. It's just all gone. You know, and in places of, it's okay if you're middle class and you've got, you know, somewhere nice to live and you've got money in the bank and you haven't got to worry about food or, you know, being warm or having something to eat. But in parts of this country, like in Cornwall, you know, they're the poorest area in Northern Europe. There's no employment. There's no money. They're living off of food banks. It's anyway. That's this concept of a lockdown is a concept. You know, you've got eminent doctors like Bruce Lipton who say, look, you can't stop a virus spreading. You know, what you can do is treat people once they get the symptoms, put all the resources into that. You know, the reality in this country, we've got a national health system where everybody can get free healthcare. And they've run it down over the last 30, 40 years, successive governments. They just couldn't cope with a virus, or thought they couldn't. They didn't put the resources into more hospitals and training people and to have more sanitary conditions. And it's treatable. It's a viral flu. The thing is, all right, we've got COVID-19 now. What if something else comes along that's even more virulent? Because nature has a way of doing this. You know, it's like Dutch elm disease with trees. You know, they had a royal commission. How can we stop the elm trees dying? Yeah, this is an awful thing. And they came up with, you can't stop it dying, elm trees dying. It's spread by a beetle. You can't kill all the beetles. So you just let the trees die, let them fall down, and more trees will grow in their place, not elms. You know, it's
right.
Do you see? So we've got COVID-19 now. What if we get COVID-21 and it's more virulent? What do we do?
So the beauty of the attitude is to let everyone have their opinion, and let life unfold the way it unfolds, and then have an attitude towards life that says, here it is. This is what I have. This is my
the way the
pleasure
mop flops. That's what my old boss used to say. That's the way the mop flops. You know, pain or pleasure, I think he was pointing to. He was a very, very wise man. He'd say, well, that's the way. He was never attached to outcomes, I now see. He said, well, that's the way the mop flops. We did our best. It didn't come off. Let's do something else. Let's not worry about it.
Yeah. So
Thank
finding
you,
that causes this is the problem.
Yes.
Rather, it's if we see, okay, this is how the mop flops, and move from there.
Sure, but we're just decimating people's lives. They're just not living as human beings. You know, actors can't act, singers can't sing, dancers can't dance. You know, it's those people, that's their lives. You know, it's what they're here for. Anyway, I do appreciate all the teachings, Roger, and you have really, really changed my life completely. Totally, completely. Thank you so much.
That's yeah, nice of you to drop in, Martin. All are happening according to God's will. I think that's about it for today. I'll be back again on Saturday.